Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about your quarter 4 project and we're going to go through the checklist part 1, part 2, and part 3. Today I've got my buddy Tucker here to help me out in explaining your project. Part 1 is worth 12 points and it's going to be due April 29th. For part 1, you're going to have to complete the 2 graphic organizers that are going to help you write your paragraphs. Before we get into the graphic organizers, I want you to turn to pages 2 and 3 that were in your packet, and it says you decide the value of city-states. With this project, you're going to have to look at the government during the Renaissance and the factor that the city-state form of government and the value that the city-states had in the Renaissance and the form of government that they had. You're going to have to look at these pages and read about the disadvantages. You see the disadvantages here. And on page 617, you're going to have to look at, that was the advantages, and you're going to have to look at the disadvantages. What I want you to do now is I want you to take some time, pause the video, and read through these 2 pages, the advantages and the disadvantages, at the bullet points underneath each. When you've completed reading the bullet points for each of them, you need to please circle either advantages or disadvantages. I'm doing this with my left hand, so it might be a little shaky. You need to either circle, it's going to be really shaky, advantages or disadvantages. Whichever one you think holds true, advantages or disadvantages, for having the city-state form of government, you need to circle that at the end of looking at all of the bullet points. Go ahead and pause the video and do that now. We're going to go on to part 2 of the of the project. I apologize. Part 2. Part 2 is due May 9th, and it is worth 6 points. Part 2 is going to be the rough draft of your paper. Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about your quarter 4 project, and we're going to go through the checklist for all 3 parts of your project. First, we're going to start at part 1, and I've got my buddy Tucker here who's going to help me explain the project to you. Part 1 is completing the 2 graphic organizers that will help you to write your paragraphs, and that's going to be due on April 29th. Before you're able to really complete your graphic organizers, you're going to have to really kind of figure out what is this project about. You're going to have to read pages 16 and 617 in your book, and we've also provided them for you today in your packet. Your paper is going to be about if during the Renaissance, the city-states, the value of the city-states, and was that form of government really helpful? Did that really allow to help the Renaissance to grow and to expand the way that it did? What you're going to do is you're going to read pages 616 and 617 in your book. You're going to read about the advantages as well as the disadvantages of that type of government. What I want you to do is I want you to pause the video now, and I want you to read through these 2 pages, whether you read them in your book or you read them out of the packet. Either one is okay, but you need to read through all of these bullet points. Go ahead and pause the video and do that now. Now that you've read about the advantages and disadvantages of having the city-state form of government, you're going to have to decide, was it an advantage? Did it really help it? Or was it a disadvantage? So what I want you to do at this time, I want you to either circle advantages or disadvantages. Whichever one you think was true for the Renaissance period, that the city-states were an advantage to their form of government, or that the city-states were a disadvantage to that form of government. Go ahead and circle whichever one you agree with now. Now, looking at the graphic organizers that you are going to have to complete. The main idea box. This is where you're going to have to answer the question, during the Renaissance, was the city-state form of government a good idea or was it a bad idea? You are going to have to answer that, restating that question in a sentence in this main idea box up top here. Remember, to find the question, if you forget what the question is about for your project, you can come look on your graphic organizer, on your checklist, and it'll tell you right here under main idea. During the Renaissance, was the city-state form of government a good idea or a bad idea? It tells you right there on your project checklist. Now we're going to go back to the graphic organizer and we're going to look at the evidence part. This goes back to the 2 pages that you just read about, whichever one you decided. If you decided to use disadvantages, you're going to take one of these bullet points, or if you decided advantages, you're going to take one of the bullet points under advantages, and you're going to use that for your evidence. Now, with your evidence, you need to make sure that you include an evidence sentence starter before you give your evidence. That can be in the text it's stated, according to the textbook Journey Across Time. In the reading it said. Any one of those would have been okay, but you need to make sure that you reference the text before you give your evidence. Now remember, when giving your evidence, you can give it in 2 separate ways. You can either paraphrase it in your own words, or you can put it word for word, but you need to make sure that you have it in quotation marks. Okay, your evidence is always going to go back and support your main idea. The third part of your graphic organizer is your supporting details. You have 3 supporting details. And remember, where does your supporting details come from? It's from your head, your own ideas, your own thoughts. So whatever your evidence is, say for example, the piece of evidence I chose was the divided city-states were weaker than a united Italy would have been, so they were often invaded by foreign groups. That's this bullet point right here. My supporting details need to support this piece of evidence. So they need to say, why would weaker city-states, why would that be a bad thing? Think in your head, having a weak city-state, having a weak government, having a weak city, why would that be a bad thing? It says here that they were invaded by foreign groups. Why would it be a bad thing to be invaded? Think about it. Would you want Waukegan to be invaded by foreign groups? If not, why wouldn't you? What would that cause? Why would that be a bad thing? And that's where your supporting detail is going to come into play. You need to write 3 supporting details, and then you need to write your conclusion. Your conclusion is going to sum up your entire paragraph, or your entire graphic organizer in this case, in 1 sentence. Now, where some of you get lost with the graphic organizers is both graphic organizers are going to support the same thing. So they're either both going to support that the city-state form of government was a good thing, or both paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 are going to support why it was a bad thing. So your main ideas are going to be similar, simply phrased differently. Your evidence, you are going to have different pieces of evidence that support the same idea, and your supporting ideas are going to be different because they support the evidence. So you need to make sure that both paragraph 1 and 2 cover the same idea, but have different pieces of evidence. That is part 1 of your project. Part 2 of your project, going back to the checklist. That is going to be due May 9th, and that is worth 6 points. This is going to be your rough draft of your project. So you are going to take your graphic organizer that you wrote in, which you turned into me, and then I wrote corrections on. You are going to take that graphic organizer with my corrections, and you are going to write it into paragraph form. Remember, complete sentences, your capitalization, your punctuation. You need to make sure to indent your paragraphs. So you're going to take those the graphic organizer and those sentences you wrote on there, and you're going to write it into actual paragraph form. You need to make sure that it answers the question and it justifies your position on whether the city-state form of government was a good or a bad idea. And you're going to have to make sure that your rough draft includes all the parts of MESC. So your main idea, your evidence, your support, and your conclusion. In your packet on the very last page is included the exact rubric that I use to grade your paper. So even though it's a rough draft, the more work you put in now means the less work you're going to have to put in for part 3. So look at this graphic organizer when you're doing it. At this rubric when you're doing it, so that way you can make sure that you included every single point that I'm going to grade on. With part 2 of your project, you are going to be writing it on a separate piece of paper. You can either write it neatly on a separate piece of paper, or you can type it if that's what you prefer. So remember, look at the graphic organizer. Read the corrections that I made on your graphic organizer because I put them there to benefit you, to help you, and write it into paragraph form. Part 3 of your project is very similar to part 2, but this is your final draft, and that is due on May 21st, and that's going to be worth 20 points. I am going to grade it just like I graded the rough draft, and I'm going to look again at the rubric, at the rubric that's on the very last page of your project. So make sure, once again, that you're referencing that rubric to help you out. Part 3 of your project, again, when you turn in your project, your part 2 of your project on May 9th, I'm going to collect that, correct it, make corrections on there, and I'm going to turn it back to you. You're going to have to take that paragraph, those 2 paragraphs that you wrote, fix it based on the corrections that I gave you and that we talked about, and you're going to have to rewrite it on a new piece of paper. Again, type it if you prefer, and turn that back in. And that is the third and final part of your project. If you have any questions about your project, write them down in your packet, and we will discuss them when we discuss your project in class. Please make sure when you come to class you have already read pages 616 and 617 and circled either advantages or disadvantages, whichever one you think the city-state form of government, whether it was an advantage during the Renaissance time or a disadvantage. Adios, amigos. Tucker says bye too. Say bye, Tuck. See you later, guys.